Hello and welcome back to Photo History. This is our week 4 lecture. This week we're going to be looking at the advent of modernism in photography and specifically modernist art photography. In your text last week we got into pictorialism, and this is the phase that comes after pictorialism. First, we need to get into some background ideas and context. As we've been doing each week, I find that the textbook is great because it has a lot of detail, but it's also helpful to draw in some of the broader historical context, especially things that were happening in the world of philosophy and the broader art world. This helps connect what's happening in photography to the rest of the history of ideas, and I think it makes photography more interesting. It makes more sense out of any history that you read, the more connections you can make between things that you're learning. And you can see how things don't just arrive out of a vacuum, but many things influence trends in photography, art, science. They're all related to each other. First, I want to sketch out some ideas that will show kind of the flow of what was being discussed in philosophy and about how ideas of epistemology, which is the study of how we know what we know. It's a little technical term from philosophy for you. But how ideas about epistemology, truth, and human nature trickle down into art and influence the works that we've been examining. In the 1600s, the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes argued that while our minds and bodies have distinct essences, they still interact with each other. These two essences were matter and mind. So again, while they're distinct from each other, they do interact. The thinking self cannot be doubted, but our senses can. So the person doing the thinking, you can't doubt your own existence because it requires thought to do that. Whereas he thought that our senses can sometimes be unreliable. You may have heard the famous saying, "I think, therefore I am," and Descartes is the one responsible for that. The original Latin for that was cogito ergo sum. And he made the individual thinker the arbiter of truth and certainty rather than, for example, religious authority. So he placed that on the individual, which kicked off what we now refer to as modern philosophy. We use the term modern often to mean things that are contemporary and happening right now, but technically when we're discussing, let's say, philosophy and other disciplines, you have to understand whether the person using the term modern means contemporary as in right now, or do they mean modern as in the paradigm shift in thinking that happened in the 1600s onward. Next, we'll look at Scottish philosopher David Hume. So Descartes was in the 1600s. Descartes became famous and noteworthy right away during his lifetime. He was well known. In the 1700s, David Hume argued differently. He held that there actually is no such thing as the self, just a bundle of perceptions. So rather than, he's taking almost the exact opposite approach of Descartes, who held that the only thing you can know with certainty is that you exist, and you know this because you think thoughts. David Hume actually felt the opposite. He felt that we're just a bundle of perceptions and basically appetites and desires and emotions, and that our reason and rationality were kind of ruled by these other non-rational parts of our being. He also believed that we can't have innate pre-existing ideas about things, which Descartes did think. He felt that we can only know something from experiencing it. Next, in the late 1700s, Immanuel Kant came along and argued that we can't know anything as it is in itself, and our minds structure this mass of perceptions we experience by imposing ideas of space, time, and causality onto them. So think of this as a conversation happening over hundreds of years. One philosopher puts an idea out, it gets bounced around, argued about, people decide this sounds pretty good. Another philosopher comes along, maybe a generation or two later, and has to interact with it because it's considered important, comes up with their own ideas that maybe critique or refine it, and then the process continues. So Kant is coming later in this conversation that we're starting. It didn't start with Descartes. It was going on even before him, but we're jumping in kind of arbitrarily. We have to start somewhere. We're jumping in with Descartes, going to Hume, and now Kant comes along, and inspired by David Hume, is trying to find a way to balance this, what has become known as the mind-body problem. How do we understand the relationship between what happens in our minds, which can't be observed, versus outward behaviors and things that we experience? He termed his position transcendental realism. A way to kind of summarize this is that the mind shapes the world it perceives. He didn't think that those categories of space, time, and causality are necessarily real things in and of themselves, but he thought that the only way you can understand anything is for our minds to impose those categories on things. So this tug of war over the place of reason and experience and sense perception would eventually coalesce into debates between idealists, who held that objects don't exist independently of the minds that perceive them, and realists, who thought that objects do exist independently of any mind or concept about them. But so despite this back and forth between these ideas and these camps, science had enough momentum from the Enlightenment ideas about the primacy of rationality and the scientific method that it would continue to flower while these philosophical debates are happening. Whatever struggles philosophers might have been having with understanding human nature and how we know things, scientists proceeded anyway, and it was still common to assume that an objective understanding of something could be had. By 1859 and the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, there's full faith in science and human reason to unlock the mysteries of the world. So a way to break this down very simply is human reason is the main arbiter of truth, which gave the scientific method, which leads to improvements in technology, which was viewed as progress. The Industrial Revolution at first seemed to bear this out, this idea of progress. But unfortunately, it empowered and enriched some while impoverishing and dehumanizing others. As we discussed earlier in our lecture videos, Romanticism, and specifically in photography, pictorialism, can be seen as some early reactions to the Industrial Revolution. Here's another example, just because this stuff it's really beautiful and I enjoy looking at it. This is by a Belgian photographer named Leonard Misson, and some early autochromes is some of the very first color work, a very early color process from 1907, as you can see, by British photographer Mervyn O'Gorman. At the very least, I think we can say that this reaction against the Industrial Revolution, it may not have been always conscious and intentional. One thing that is sometimes interesting and frustrating and wonderful about people is that we're not always consistent living out our ideals. We don't always do things out of reflection. Sometimes it's just instinct and maybe we think about it later. So when we look at Romanticism and pictorialism, we can say that maybe not every instance of it is a thought out intentional reaction against the Industrial Revolution, but I think it's easy to see how, at the very least, it could be a subconscious reaction against it. This discontent that we see with the Industrial Revolution couldn't be dealt with just through art movements alone. And you start to see that discontent bubbling up into revolutionary movements, and you start to see those revolutionary desires addressed in philosophy. The famous one being Karl Marx, who's writing, he's a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And the most notable of these revolutionary movements, and probably the most important one as far as its impact on world history, would be the Russian Revolution of 1917. Here's a photo of Vladimir Lenin from the time. At this time, standard conventions of depiction in art were beginning to change and break down. So they were changing from realistic and representational and often very classical to the avant-garde and experimental. In 1913 in New York City, the Armory show brought a lot of contemporary avant-garde art from Europe to the US for the first time, and it shocked many viewers who were used to very classical, traditional looking art. So here's an example of one of the works that was in that show was Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. So imagine this was a kind of thing people were accustomed to. Again, this is overtly referencing classical subject matter, and it's depicted in a classical way. Imagine coming to the show and seeing this. You might be scandalized by the sight of it. Color palette here is soft, here it's muted, earth tones, perspective. It has many perspectives all at once. Here's some more samples. This by Francis Picabia, The Procession of Seville. Here's George Braque. John Twachtman Hemlock Pool. Pablo Picasso, someone we've probably all heard of before, with Woman with Mustard Pot. This would have been very shocking. Around the same time, you have composers like Igor Stravinsky coming onto the scene, and there were near riots at some of his performances of his work, which was kind of the musical equivalent of what you're seeing in these paintings. Starting in World War I, which began the year after the Armory Show, the world was introduced to wholesale industrialized death and slaughter. An estimated 20 million people died. 21 million people were wounded. In a single day during the Battle of the Somme, the British Army alone suffered over 57,000 casualties. I think it's hard for us today to wrap our minds around those kinds of numbers, to even understand what that would have been like. Entire generations were wiped out. As I mentioned earlier, Descartes' ideas about the essences of mind and matter introduced the concept of dualism into philosophy. And I think you can make the case that there's a kind of dualism that's present in photography right from the outset. On the one hand, we have the daguerreotype, which was thought of as being a very accurate recorder of reality. And it was daguerreotypes that were used by advocates of photography to argue that it could be a tool of science. On the other hand, we noticed how the calotype was seized on very early as something that could be used as a tool of the arts, as something that emotion could be projected into, as something that could express the subjective experience of the artist. Broadly speaking, we can see a change and a transition in the subject matter of art. During medieval times, it was predominantly religious. So here's an Eastern Orthodox icon from medieval times. And then as the Renaissance takes hold, even when art is still being commissioned by the Catholic Church, it begins to have more humanistic themes that are not always necessarily explicitly religious. So here's a detail from the Sistine Chapel. And as the Renaissance progresses, the subject matter broadens to include things like portraits, landscapes, history, myth, still life, and beauty. Here's an example by Albert Dürer, his famous picture of the hare, and a portrait. As we've been discussing, a lot of this was for the consumption of the upper classes, and then as the middle class became a real thing, and as it grew, they wanted to participate in this also. Here's a detail from one of those amazing paintings by Turner, The Burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons. So let's return to our examples of modern art. So we saw how in most of Western European art, what was for a long time mainly religious, broadened during the Renaissance to other kinds of subject matter. And then as the middle class grew and there were more people to consume the arts, whether commissioning works or collecting or viewing, the kinds of subject matter depicted grew. By the early 20th century, subject matter had become very experimental and revolutionary, and it became more social and political. So why this sudden shift in subject matter? Why did work look so different? Why were the things that it depicted so different from the art that came not that much prior to it? Why was it so different? As we pointed out, a lot of these changes were already afoot in the late 1800s, very early 1900s. But World War I really gave all of those trends a huge push. In Europe in particular, with such huge loss of life there, Europeans really began to doubt every institution that they thought had been responsible for creating such a society where this could happen. This disillusionment could be seen in music, in painting, in every area of the arts, where sensitive people were re-examining every aspect of society. One movement that emerged from this post-war disillusionment and disenchantment was known as Dada, or Dadaism, which was an avant-garde art movement that celebrated the absurd and the irrational as a way of destroying the values of what it saw as the society responsible for the slaughter of World War I. Dadaists viewed society as irrational, chaotic, savage, inhuman, in flux, absurd, as we mentioned. Here's an example, another famous one by Marcel Duchamp, who is a huge, huge figure in the art world of the 20th century, known as The Fountain. As you can see, it's a urinal turned on its side, and the word armut and a date written on it. There's another by Francis Picabia. We saw one of his paintings earlier. This is kind of that absurdity. You can see a spark plug and it says forever on it. Here's what looks like a diagram of an electrical circuit, but there's a woman's corset and other kind of nonsense items just thrown in. There's one by Hans Bellmer called La Poupée Berlin, and they were often grotesque. They were meant to shock. They were meant to be savage. Here's a famous work by Hannah Hoke called Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Beer Belly of the Weimar Republic, and a work by Raoul Hausmann called The Art Critic. And here's a work by Man Ray, who was born of Russian Jewish immigrant parents in the US, but spent quite a bit of time in Europe. He was back and forth, but spent significant time in Paris. This is one of his drawings that he contributed to the Dadaist movement. He also was a photographer. This is an example of what's called a photogram. He referred to them as rayograms, but these are essentially using photographic materials but without a camera or any lenses. So he has light-sensitive photo paper and he's placing objects on it, exposing it to light, and making images through silhouettes and shadows and light. Another example of a photogram. When I teach my beginning black and white darkroom classes, this is one of the first things we do to get students acquainted with how their paper works, how to process a print in the darkroom. And students usually underestimate how difficult it is to make an interesting image, but after a few tries they realize it's actually quite difficult. Here's an example of something that's more straightforwardly photographic but has a surreal tinge to it. And Dadaism had much in common with Surrealism. Surrealism came a little bit later, but many of the people involved with Dadaism were also involved with Surrealism, including Man Ray. Here's one of his works called Egg and Shell. This utilizes a technique called solarization, where a print is exposed, development is stopped, it's exposed to more light, then it goes back into the development process, and it creates this strange kind of halo effect, and some of the values will start to flip. So this highlight here may initially have been actually a shadow or a dark area that started to flip, and it's a tricky process. It takes quite a bit of patience to get it to where you can control it. Solarization is taken far enough, it can result in all of the values flipping to the exact opposite of what they started out with. If he had let this example continue, it would have looked like his negative that was used to make the print. Surrealism, as we noted, is closely related to Dadaism, whereas Dada was really kind of an anti-art movement. It looked to transgress every possible artistic value or convention, whereas Surrealism was more interested in using art to explore Freud's theories of the repressed unconscious. So it valued intuitive perception, found symbols, the accidental, what they called automatic writing and drawing, which was just to begin writing or drawing or painting and try to let it happen naturally without any intervention of your mind or your thoughts or your reason to guide it. The most famous surrealist, of course, is Salvador Dali. Here's his painting, Invisible Lion, Horse, Sleeping Woman. So you can see it has an absurdity to it, but it's an absurdity that's really founded more in the kinds of strange things that might appear in our dreams. Here's a photographic example of surrealism by Andrei Kertész. He had a whole series called Distortions. Here's a couple of examples. Some more photographic surrealism. This is by Philippe Halsman. This is called Dali's Mustache. He and Dali collaborated together on works for over 30 years. It's another Philippe Halsman photograph. There's Dali. A few cats and some water and suspended chairs. It took approximately 26 takes to get this photograph. Another movement that emerged from post-war Europe was called the Bauhaus. This was a German art school that was founded by Walter Gropius. It lasted from 1919 to 1933. The view of the Bauhaus school was that art should be a marriage of craft and vision and function and aesthetics. It influenced a lot of the design that we see today, everything from our phones and laptops to graphic design, typography, art, furniture design, architecture, photography, films. So if you've seen any film noir movies, American, kind of the hard-boiled detective films from the 30s and 40s, those were influenced by German Expressionism, which was influenced by the Bauhaus. Here's an example by the Hungarian photographer Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. He's also working with the photogram process, which is there's no lens, no camera involved, but we do have light-sensitive materials. Very abstract, but with beautiful forms and tones and gradations. Like Man Ray, he also at times made photographs that utilized a camera and were easy to identify as photography, but he was searching for compositions that were not so straightforward and obvious. Here's a long exposure, one of the few color ones that I've seen of Moholy-Nagy. And another photogram. Here's Moholy-Nagy taking advantage of the kind of vantage point that the average viewer would not have had access to. So in a tower looking straight down, turning real views and real scenes into things that are nearly as abstract as his photograms. This one looks very abstract, and then you see a human face here, and then you have some grounding and a little bit of orientation. Here's another photograph of real objects, but framed and composed in a way that makes them more abstract. These European art movements, such as Bauhaus, Dada, and in the Soviet Union, constructivism, which we'll look at a little bit later, in light of their disillusionment with society following World War I, they viewed art's job as, quote, the analysis and rational reconstruction of industrial society, rather than a means of producing unique decorative objects based on personal feelings or experiences for an elite class, according to our textbook. So you can see how they're pushing really hard to make images in an uncharacteristic and unusual way to disorient the viewer and make them work to understand the imagery, whereas more classical, conventional art could easily be understood and the viewer never felt disoriented. Let's look through these again as we continue our discussion. Photographers of this time were influenced by all of these movements, some directly because they were living in Europe, either Americans living there or Europeans. There was some back and forth transatlantic movement of these ideas, but they felt it gave them, as Rosenblum says, the freedom to fragment and restructure reality. So they made experiments with distortion and unique, unusual views and perspective that could be used to express, as Rosenblum says again, disturbing personal or social realities. Great liberty was taken with these compositional styles and strategies, including the use of extreme angles and vantage points, such as this one, close-up views and abstraction, to emphasize patterns, textures, and structures. So this photo is a great example of something that when you look at it hard enough, you understand there's a tower. These look like they might be tables and umbrellas down at the bottom. So we can find things that we know what they are, but it's presented to us in a way that's disorienting enough that we understand that what we're really meant to look at is the shapes and forms and values and tones and texture. These avant-garde and modernist art movements were mainly products of European views and experiments, and then they were taken up in the US by people who had exposure to them or who had come from Europe. The Bauhaus itself, when Hitler came to power, was forced to shut down, and many of the professors from the Bauhaus emigrated to the US, including Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And the Bauhaus was essentially reconstituted in the US in Chicago, and it was known as the Institute of Design. Americans came away from World War I with very different views, partly on account of entering the war late. Therefore, we lost far fewer soldiers, we spent less money, and the US emerged from World War I with a stronger economy and a stronger standing in the world. America essentially cemented its status as a superpower after World War I. Because of this, Americans, on the whole, did not experience the same disillusionment and disenchantment that Europeans did, and this was also reflected in its art and photography. America still retained its faith in what it viewed as the positive benefits of industrial production. The new photography that emerged from this, think of it as post-pictorialism, was sometimes called precisionism or so-called straight photography, which was meant to imply that there was no manipulation, unlike pictorialism, where often much was done to introduce the artist's hand into the photograph. Here's some examples by some of the bigger names in this movement. First, here's Imogen Cunningham. You can see that they're very sharp, very detailed. The compositions sometimes could be more abstract, but they don't have the same kind of fracturing and menace and the sort of dark tone that much of the European art of the time exhibited. Edward Weston was one of the biggest figures of this time. This image is from a series he made at the Oceano Dunes. One of his more famous pictures, this shell. He has other photographs of a nautilus shell. I've seen one of these prints in person, and I have to say you really must see it in person. Quite stunning. And while Weston's subject matter is very diverse, this is a cabbage leaf. There's a nautilus shell, dunes, and perhaps his most famous photograph, this pepper. What they all have in common is Weston's concern with form, light and shadow, and texture. It's easy to see the same eye and the same mind composing these, and it's almost irrelevant what the subject matter is. For Weston, it's about the forms and the value and the light and shadow. Next is Margaret Bourke-White. She photographed a lot of architecture and industry. Later, she photographed during World War II and took some of the first photographs of concentration camps. But I think her work during this time is a good example of the positive view of Americans towards industry and technology. This is from the construction of a dam that she photographed. Probably the biggest name in photography, if not in the 20th century, perhaps ever, is Ansel Adams. Even if you've never heard his name, the odds are pretty good that you've seen one of his photographs of Yosemite, which were really instrumental in helping preserve a lot of the West and expanding a lot of our national parks. Adams is known for his technical mastery and complete control over his camera and his materials. And while it's easy in this day to dismiss Ansel Adams as merely the maker of pretty pictures, I would also say that if you ever have a chance to see any of his original prints in person, you really must do so. His command of his technique and his materials was second to none. Next in this group is Laura Gilpin. These photographers, especially Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Laura Gilpin, some others, associated together and often photographed together and formed a group called the F64 group. They were called that because they preferred to work at smaller apertures like F64 because it allowed for sharper details, more depth of field. It was really the opposite approach to pictorialism. Paul Strand was another member of this group. He was able to work in a more modern, abstract way with his compositions like this, but also later he did some more documentary style work, but he's probably most famous for his abstractions. Next, we'll look at some Russian photography. Russia suffered perhaps the worst casualties of anyone during World War I, and their country suffered greatly during, so much so that it helped spur the 1917 revolution, and they pulled out of World War I. Their revolution became a civil war that lasted through the rest of the 19-teens and into the early 1920s, and resulted in the formation of the Soviet Union. The avant-garde movement that the Soviet Union is known for is called constructivism. The constructivists saw themselves as creating art and design in service of the revolution, and most of them were quite devoted to this cause. In spite of that, Vladimir Lenin viewed them as being degenerate, but tolerated them. He kind of kept this view to himself, but tolerated them. Later, under Stalin, they fell from favor because Stalin himself thought that their work was too intellectual, because of its intellectualism, was suspect as being possibly not revolutionary enough. So Stalin decided that a more documentary approach best reflected the values of working people. Almost overnight, constructivists were either out of jobs, some ended up in labor camps and died. Alexander Rodchenko was one of the bigger names of this movement. He was both a photographer and a graphic designer. El Lissitzky was another. His design work has been very influential in Western graphic design. Some of his design was used to make propaganda for the revolution. Here you can see him combining photography with design. To summarize what we've covered so far, in just a few short decades, photography went from being a medium that had to fight for respectability and to even be recognized as an art form. It was a medium that often consciously mimicked the sensibilities and the aesthetic of the established arts of the time. But in just a few short decades, because of societal changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution and new ideas in political philosophy, and then catalyzed by the immense destruction of World War II, photography saw a huge explosion in different ways of depicting and visualizing ideas in new processes, new forms. And during this time, it really came into its own and matured as a tool of the arts. As we look back through just a few of the slides we've examined in this lecture, you can see this immense explosion of new ways of visualizing and examining things in front of the camera, and in many cases without a camera. These new styles and new aesthetics mirrored the chaos and fragmentation in society as artists struggled to tear down the rotten vestiges of a society that caused so much destruction and attempt to reimagine new ways of being. And lastly, the dualism that we have seen playing out in photography continues during this time. On the one hand, there is the Dada and Surrealist movements that regard reason and rationality with, at best, suspicion, and in the case of Dada, with outright disdain for it, in the celebration of the absurd and the ugly and savage. I think we have yet to see whether or not this dualism can be bridged, but perhaps that's a task for you and I to solve with our own photography, our own images, our own thoughts, our own writings.